Good morning, and welcome to this webinar on who is funding the campus protesters. My name is Jacob Olidort. I'm Director of Research at Jinsa's Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy. I invite you all to visit our website, jinsa.org, to access all of our resources related to Israel's current war and related developments. And for those of you tuning in today, if you have any questions, please, I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to type out your question, and I'll do my very best to pose all the questions there to our panelists in the discussion portion of today's program. Before beginning the program, I'd like to recognize the very important day today is on Israel's calendar, Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Day of Remembrance, when we honor those who fell defending the state of Israel in its wars, as well as the victims of terrorist attacks. Of course, this evening, Israelis will move from a mood of somber mood to one of celebration when we mark the 76 years since the founding of the State of Israel. This year, of course, will be very different from all other years, no doubt because of the last 7 months. And one lesson we've certainly learned is that Israel's adversaries, as well as those of the United States, know no borders. So tragically and shockingly, one window into that is our campuses right here at home, just blocks away from me here at GW University. For example, we are witnessing sights and sounds hearkening to a century ago, overtly calling for the murder of Jews, the dress and flags of terrorist organizations, all of which suggests, as will be discussed today by our distinguished panel, that this is not simply students exercising free speech, but is in fact driven by, and perhaps even incorporating the involvement of organizations and individuals with destructive agendas, many of them with direct links to terrorist organizations. That is the subject of today's discussion. We are delighted to have with us two individuals who've been writing, thinking, conducting research on these issues really for many years now, but who have certainly been observing the developments over the last month, especially with the disturbing emergence of the Gaza Solidarity so-called encampments that have resulted in over 2,000 arrests by police over trespassing and assault and damaged property and other what's been going on campus here over the last month. So without further ado, let me briefly introduce our panelists today. Mr. Ira Stoll is editor of The Editors. He has held a number of editorial positions at previous institutions, including as vice president and managing editor of the New York Sun, where I was actually briefly an intern in college, and then a managing editor, the North American editor of the Jerusalem Post, managing editor of the Forward and other publications. Mr. Stoll, welcome. We're delighted to have you here with us today. And Professor Gerald Steinberg is Emeritus Professor of Political Science at Bar-Ilan University, and he is, since 2002, the founder and president of Jerusalem-based NGO Monitor. I'm going to read it here, which provides information and analysis, provides accountability, and supports discussion on the reports and activities of NGOs, that is, non-governmental organizations that claim to advance human rights and humanitarian agendas. Thank you both so much again for your time and sharing your insights with us today. Let me just get right into it and ask both of you, you've written a lot about this, who is behind the protests? Who's funding them? Who's organizing them? Who do we have to think about and be concerned about here? So whoever would like to start first.
I'll throw it in, and then Ira, you have a lot to say on this as well, so I'll try to make it short. I'm going to answer the question, not so much with a question, but another statement in standard Jewish format. The question is, where did this come about? It's clearly not spontaneous. We know more about bits and pieces of it. Putting it together is more difficult because the main leaders of this, the organizations that we're aware of, have been hiding a lot of their infrastructure, their funding, their donors, the number of paid people they have, the employees. All that is very carefully hidden. And there's a network out there, and I think we need to talk about it as a network rather than as individual organizations. And certainly, again, the myth that this is somehow spontaneous, as you said, spontaneous expression of free speech is clearly not the case. So let's start with the Students for Justice for Palestine. which claims to have 300 branches. That's obviously a huge exaggeration, but they do have something like 100 that we've at NGO Monitor have been able to identify, between 80 and 100 active branches in terms of having events on campus, having social media pushes, various other aspects of that. First, a branch of Students for Justice of Palestine was established in Berkeley in 1993. So they've been around now for over 30 years, that particular aspect of it. But of course, it went through different phases and has been growing. And I would look particularly in the period of the last 20 years when, after what was called the Durban Conference, the UN conference on the elimination of racism, was turned into an anti-Semitic major UN event that set up the entire strategy. Called Israel, at the time, the final declaration, 5,000 delegates from 1,500 non-governmental organizations, many of them still involved in all of what we're seeing on campuses. Israel is an apartheid state. Israel commits genocide, called for the complete international isolation of Israel. All of that is what we're seeing now on the campuses, the same language that's out there. So this is, I think, a very broad infrastructure with a lot of organizations and individuals involved. Names change, but it's all carefully hidden. None of them have what's called the IRS 501c3 tax status. It's all done with basically cards and mirrors, moving money around. They claim to be volunteers. Clearly, there's a very major infrastructure. Just add one quick other point. Right after October 7th, I think on October 8th, they came out with a toolkit. Students for Justice for Palestine sent around a toolkit, a very detailed set of instructions, including slogans, including tactics to be used. And that's what we're seeing now on the university campuses. That was clearly well organized, well thought out, didn't just all of a sudden show up after 24 hours.
Mr. Stoller, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is a network, and in some cases it depends on the particular campus who's calling the shots. But what I was able to report in this Wall Street Journal piece is there is this group called the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which actually does have a 501c3 called Education for Just Peace, which is itself like, almost Orwellian, like, so if you're searching for Palestinian or BDS or, it just comes, you'd have to figure out, which I did, that Education for Just Peace is the name of this organization. And it has a board. Interestingly enough, actually, the director of it is somebody who was very involved in Florida in the anti-police violence movement. And that's actually something that is worth paying attention to, whether you call it intersectionality or partnerships, alliances. There's a lot of overlap between anti-capitalist or anti-fossil fuel groups and the anti-Israel groups and the defund the police, Black Lives Matter groups. And actually, I was talking about this on Fox News the other night, where they had a picture of this professional activist at Columbia named Lisa Fithian. And she's like 63 years old. And that's her job. She's like a civil disobedience consultant. Mm-hmm. And you can go back. I mean, when I was in college, I covered these people protesting against the George H.W. Bush Persian Gulf War. And then I saw them again after September 11th in New York City at the Republican National Convention, protesting against the George W. Bush Iraq War. And then, it's the same, some of the same chants, the people united will never be defeated, shut it down. And so, so some of the tactics are the same. And because this Education for Just Peace is registered, I was able to track some of the grants, and I was able to track some Rockefeller Brothers Fund money. And the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, I mean, you can look, they also support the Quincy Institute, which is a anti-war foreign policy.
Sort of an Iranian Front organization.
Yeah. And Peter Beinart, the non-Zionist New York Times writer, who also, he's a board member of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And Soros. I mean, so the Open Society Institute, which is George and Alexander Soros, they gave money to this Education for Just Peace group, which is advertising for paid fellows. And so you can look, like the woman who interrupted the Berkeley Law Dean's dinner event in the backyard of the Berkeley Law Dean, and there's a viral video about that. She's actually a paid trainer from this group, and they're advertising for new fellows between $2,880 and $3,360 for 3 months for 8 hours of work. And they have a weekly Monday night Zoom for all these activists to share tactics and plan. So you're seeing the same things, like these encampments sprung up everywhere at the same time.
Ira, let's go in a little bit further and deeper into this. I think it's what the points you made are important. There's a big layer that we don't know about. And SJP, Hatem Bazian, who founded, or was one of the founders of it, SJP, who's also involved in American Muslims for Palestine, and they get the money through various convoluted routes. That's a big chunk of this. But then there are parts that we do know about. We know nothing about how they're connected together. But we do see very closely that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund has been involved in this for about 10, 15 years. And we started to track this back at that time. And it's Stephen Hines, who was at one time Senator Joe Lieberman's chief of staff, is running this program at Rockefeller Brothers. They were the major funder for Jewish Voice for Peace, which is the supposedly Jewish fig leaf for the Palestinian organizations, particularly for SJP, giving them the facade of not being fundamentally anti-Semitic. That's funded, a large chunk of the funding, $150,000 for the current phase, which is 2023 to 26, is funded by the Rockefeller Brothers. So you have the U.S. campaign, you have that, you have It Not Now, another Jewish fig leaf, you have Palestine Legal, does a lot of the legal work. And together, these are close to $500,000, $600,000 chunks of money. It's not the major money, we don't think, that goes into these protests. But Stephen Hines, the Rockefeller Brothers, says we're going to use this money, this tax-exempt money, under a program to bring peace to the Middle East. And how are we going to do that? We're going to divide the Jewish community in the United States. We're going to drive a wedge between the Jewish community in the United States and Israel. And that's part of what we're seeing with these Jewish fig leaves and aligning themselves with the Palestinian groups. And in addition to the Rockefeller Brothers, there's something called the Tide Center. They don't hand out money for peace projects, but they are a $900+ million, almost $1 billion framework to hide money for progressive causes. Some of them pay salaries, some of that money is used to pay salaries, but there's no detailed information. And that's something that's got to be really addressed. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think it's all, this is incredibly informative, kind of the ecosystem where all this is happening. And I get that it's very complex and there's different actors and different sources of funding. Not all of them have the same specific focus. But I mean, if we just focus in on, the National Students for Justice in Palestine, these are groups that have, I mean, this is, one generation ago was 3 charities with ties to Hamas. They've been disbanded because they've proven to provide support to terrorist organizations. It was, and it still is, the subject of a new lawsuit. So my question is, and you have staff from these organizations that are on the campuses and leadership. So why has it been, and whose fault is it, or who kind of dropped the ball on following the money on these, at least the big groups that are kind of the central nodes for, this pro-Hamas agitation? If we take that element out, then certainly kind of the veteran agitators or whatever the Marxist groups will do what they do, but they won't have sort of this like base to latch onto. So that's an open question I haven't been able to figure out. Like, why have we just missed the ball on these big groups?
So, Jinsa does great work with former military officials in the U.S. I've admired for years. I almost think we need a Jinsa for former federal and state prosecutors, because you almost need like the wiretapping and search warrant capability to go in and watch these guys. Without it, it's very hard. And so, and maybe in some of the more liberal jurisdictions, the elected law enforcement, the Soros DAs, as it were, don't have the appetite for that. But you'd think in some of the more, you'd think there'd be some U.S. attorney or state attorney general somewhere who would get curious about this, or
Right.
in a Republican administration, the IRS.
Right.
You always have to be careful with weaponizing the IRS against your political opponents. But I think, there's existing laws about what a tax exempt purpose is, and
Right.
using it to incite riots is,
Right.
or I don't know, maybe we should look at whether
Yeah.
advocating for a boycott of Israel is a tax exempt purpose.
Yeah.
Well,
And I
I
see
would
one of
go.
our questioners had that very same question. Why are we not, following these more meticulously? Yeah, Professor Steinberg.
I've been doing this for close to 20 years.
Sure. Yeah.
It was right after the Durban conference where I began to see that you have these NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And by the way, one of the characteristics of a lot of them is they get money from foreign governments. But there's no requirement for US registered organizations. I'm not talking about SJP, which is just off a map, but I'm talking about Human Rights Watch, for instance, or talking about US Campaign, other organizations that are registered with the IRS, file their tax forms, but they don't have to at all release information on all of their donors. And that's a hole in the legislative process. Now, I don't think that it means that if Congress starts to look into this and adds to the IRS regulations or requirement, seems to me basic. Foreign governments, it's not just about coming from Qatar or some other foreign sources. Human Rights Watch got money from a corrupt Saudi businessman, and according to leaked documents, also from Qatar, 3 million and probably more. But it's also a matter of, for any framework, Chinese, Russian, whoever gets money from a foreign government, if you're a US registered organization, I don't understand. Okay, I live in Israel, I follow, still American citizens, still pay my US taxes. But in many countries, there are requirements. If you get funded by a foreign government, you got to make that public. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed in conjunction with the question of how do we define the material support for terrorism, that lawsuit I think that you mentioned, which is asking that question about SJP. At what point, what are the characteristics of material support for terrorism, and have SJP and other organizations done that? Another organization, it's a whole, it's not just spaghetti, it's some other analogy of the number of different organizations that have more than a hand and a foot in this process. There's a group called Samidoun, Samidoun, which features in a lot of campuses. They are clearly recognized as a PFLP terror front. The Popular Front Liberation of Palestine is seen by the United States and most Western countries, recognized correctly as a terrorist organization. They participated. Some of their people were in October 7th, killing, murdering, raping, taking hostages. They have a group called Samidoun, outlawed in Germany, being considered for that same status in Belgium. They're operating out of Canada, basically Vancouver, and they have branches in the United States. And their flags, their material, their paraphernalia, and their people are in many of these encampments, as they're called, on university campuses. They're part of the PFLP terror structure. So that's something that needs to be looked at. I think the ball was dropped to a significant degree by those who are looking at, from the United States, that looking at the hostility towards Israel, the demonization, anti-Semitism, missing those aspects. They were looking at the language, they were looking at the ideological arguments, of course, intersectionality and wokeism, but the structure behind it and the funding behind it was something that never really caught on. I would talk to various organizations, heads of organizations, about the Rockefeller Brothers. I've already been doing this for 10 years, and there have been a number of conversations that went nowhere. Well, I asked the question, this was even before, well before October 7th. If Rockefeller Brothers and Stephen Hines are funding these organizations with the explicit goal of driving a wedge in support of the American Jewish community for Israel, why aren't there demonstrations outside the RBF building, which I think is on the east side of New York, to bring that issue out? This is Rockefeller Brothers fund money. Why is that organization been hijacked to the degree that it supports all of these groups, and definitely very much involved, as I wrote in the Wall Street Journal? Your column laid it all out very carefully. That's something that was largely known before, but ignored. So I think we have to do more following the money as a community and seeing that as an integral part, in addition to taking on their claims, the lies, the propaganda, which is also a central part of what's going on now, the counter demonstrations.
I mean, this actually
okay.
is. Go ahead. Sorry.
I would just add, with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, it's not just the Palestinian Gaza Hamas front. They were hugely involved in the Iran nuclear deal and building support for that. And so, and it's a balance, right? Because you can't say like, oh, the Arab side needs to disclose all their donors, but AIPAC or Jinsa doesn't. Like, we do have a freedom of speech and freedom of petition and freedom of assembly in this country, and you can't enforce it selectively. But on the other hand, like, neither do we want to tie our hands behind our back as foreign entities, or like basically disloyal groups, like have riots on our college campuses. So finding the right balance there, I think we haven't found the right balance. We've probably erred far too permissively in terms of the rioters. The other point I wanted to make is that some of this funding is coming from the universities themselves. Like, I worked at Harvard for 4.5 years. I left in July of 2023. And one of the things that astounded me is the students for Harvard Students for Palestine was a recognized university student group. And so they were getting student activities funding money. Like the student government was voting money for a truck and a storage unit for the apartheid wall that they put up on campus to demonize and delegitimize Israel and make false accusations of apartheid. So it's the Jewish students, their student activity fees, and the rest of the campus, and then you have the faculty advisors. They're getting paid salaries from the university. Like that, it's a history professor at Harvard, who is, and they're in the encampment. Like, that's one of the reasons they haven't cleared the encampment at Harvard, is you've got paid tenured faculty members with endowed chairs in the Harvard faculty, both tuition and endowment money. Like, those people are earning six-figure salaries to protect the students from the consequences of their behavior. And it's one reason the administration is reluctant to send the state police in there, because, you know, you're going to arrest your own professors?
Yeah.
You know,
No, I
it's
think
not
that,
just the,
go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say, it's not just the student fees and the endowment. There's huge amounts of money coming in again from foreign governments, and we always come back to Qatar. It's not only Qatar, it's
Yeah.
other governments as well that are paying, for instance, for the Middle East studies programs, for the Carr Center for Human Rights, which hired Ken Roth, who's a full-time propagandist, gave him a fellowship with zero academic capabilities. Where is their money coming from? And that we know that there's a lot of money coming from foreign governments. We now know that each university is supposed to report it, but we don't know how it gets filtered out throughout the universities. So there are basic transparency aspects that are an essential part of democracy. And certainly starting with foreign funding, whether it's for the universities, whether it's for these programs, is important. Ira, one of the things that I've always wondered about is, I'm well past the student age, but for students on these campuses who are paying fees, and some of that money goes for Students for Justice for Palestine, and some of the money goes for all sorts of other political frameworks. Those organizations have no requirements to, in fact, publish and declare their other sources of income, their salaries, who are they paying. They get away with this idea that we're just a small student group and we need a little bit of money for travel and occasional get some food so we can bring in people to see our movies. That's all one big facade, and it needs to be, I think the university should also have a requirement. Students should demand it. I'm paying my fees. I want to know all about the organizations where the money goes. They have to be totally transparent so that I know if my $15 that goes for this organization comes along with 15 million from Qatar, they can live without my money. I can pull my money out of that, and that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. No,
Totally.
there's a lot to unpack. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say one other funding stream is federal work study money. So when I was in college, if you had a financial aid package that included a campus job, you might be scrubbing toilets in dorm rooms, or cleaning dirty dishes in the dining hall, or sitting at a library counter, shelving books or checking books out. That has changed dramatically, so that, and I came against this at the Harvard Crimson, where they had a editorial endorsing BDS, and they have these, you know, terrible anti-Israel student columnists. The students are paid for their work on the Crimson. It used to be a volunteer job, but that has all changed. And so if you have a financial aid package with a campus job, now writing anti-Israel editorials at the Crimson, it can be part of your campus job.
Wow. No, I mean, it's the anecdotes. Mr. Stoll and I were talking earlier about kind of Middle East studies at Harvard, where I spent a year doing my master's. I mean, we kind of joked internally. I mean, it was based at the Semitic Museum, was the building on Divinity Road or Divinity Lane. But we joked that it's actually the Anti-Semitic Museum, because of just, you know, the kind of free pass that it gives. I mean, there's a lot here, and I do want to actually turn to audience questions. A number of them have been addressed here. So you both have alluded to it. I mean, certainly NGO Monitor, it's one of their recommendations about gaining more transparency about IRS tax filings for universities. So question first on how do you both view the response, well, the actions and then the response by university administrators? Mr. Slow, you had a piece talking about finally, I don't know if it's the Harvard president, you know, kind of, you know, told the occupiers of Harvard Yard to go, but only after a lawsuit was filed or threatened against the university by Jewish students. So I want to get both your takes on that piece, and then also understanding that a lot of this escalated due to an awareness of strong congressional oversight. Students for Justice in Palestine actually mentioned it in their 4-paragraph manifesto about the Popular University for Gaza on April 20th. They talked about the cowardly testimony of Manoush Shafiq. So I want to get your sense, knowing what we do now, about really this intricate web, this spaghetti, Professor Steinberg described it, of organizations, many of them with ties to foreign terrorist organizations. Should the administration, should Congress, is it doing enough? Is it talking about them correctly? Should it be acting differently? So whoever wants to start, both of those.
Yeah, well, so on the university responses, there's been a real range. I mean, and I
Yeah.
think we need to highlight some of the good responses. I mean, there have been university presidents who have called in police to shut this stuff down almost immediately. The Dartmouth president has been, really heroic a couple times. I mean, and the other constraining factor is in some cases the local police forces may be unwilling to act. So some of these presidents are constrained by their police forces or by the disciplinary apparatus in their schools, which in some cases have been captured. Like I haven't written this yet, but at Harvard, there's a member of the disciplinary, like a full-time person in charge of student discipline at Harvard is like an open BDS advocate.
Wow.
So I think the pressure is extremely important, whether it comes from Congress, from donors, from lawsuits, from politicians. The Biden administration's response, I think, has been both two-faced and disappointing. Biden will come out and give a speech like he did on Holocaust Remembrance Day that is very appropriate and condemns anti-Semitism and blames Hamas. And then he'll also say that the Israeli actions are over the top and indiscriminate, and he's not sending any more bombs over there. And certainly when it comes down to the rest of the administration, like they announced these investigations, but we've yet to see a single university have its federal funding cut. And that's a strong lever. Like Harvard gets $600 million a year from the federal government. If that ends, that's a huge pain point for them. So, but we've yet to see it happen. It could happen in a Trump administration, and I think that would cause colleges to take this all a lot more seriously.
Yeah.
Look, I want to take a step back and just to look at this issue from a different angle than Ira did. And I agree with everything that he said, but I think there's other dimensions to look at. The universities are easy targets. They're great places for revolutions. For all sorts of reasons that it's not just now, but academics tend to think of themselves. I've been doing it for 40 years, right? So I've been teaching in part of the university system, do a lot of guest lectures and other things in the US and Canada still. And I'm critical of a lot of my academic colleagues. In the hard sciences, which is where I started out, they really think that, many of the scientists there think that, well, okay, you have to have evidence, you have to be an academic to do hard science, moonshots and all that stuff. But if you're talking about social science, or whatever, that I think is a misnomer, you're talking about politics or law, this critical legal studies, which is really an imperialist movement to say every problem in society, our lawyers, we have a privileged position and we can solve it. And that's usually tied into things like DEI, very much of a progressive agenda, very much of an I would say, realist position in looking at the political world. So you have this concept that we can use international law to end wars. And when a country like Israel uses weapons, and we see what goes on in Gaza to defend itself, now those are all war crimes. A lot of that comes out of the academic realm. And it's this sense of empowerment and arrogance that they can solve all these problems without, in fact, having any kind of empirical base on which to check their evidence. You don't say that the world is flat, do experiments and say, well, it's not flat, it's round, we can look at you don't have that in many of the other fields. And certainly, and it's also very interdisciplinary areas that are largely, I would say, invented for the purposes of political ideology. So that's a totally different perspective. And if you look at it from that perspective, progressive political ideology solving all the world's problems through this arrogance of academic imperialism, we can do everything. Then you look at the Palestinians, the poor suffering Palestinians, and this massive superpower, this image, propagandized image of Israel as being a massive superpower. And you hear terms like disproportionality thrown out. Nobody can define disproportionality, but they use it and they say this is international law. Indiscriminate killing. Now we've gotten into apartheid. All of these, by the way, are led by non-governmental organizations. I got to put this little side aspect in. I've looked at the Carr Center for Human Rights at Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School in Harvard, and their politics. It's a very, very deeply political organization, and many of the faculty members there are exactly in that category. They have an ideology, they have a view of the world, and they think they can solve issues like war and peace through their skills. Again, no empirical evidence. It's all based on theories that have no way of being tested. And the Palestinian cause is very much the center of that. I also asked the question where they get their money for this, which is something that I think needs to be resolved. But if you look at this network of centers, that's the one I look at. It's the human rights area, and you see huge overlap between the NGOs and these academic frameworks. That's part of the process but it's not just in that field. It's in criminology, it's in sociology. As I said, it's in law schools and various other places. And I think that issue has to be addressed as well. It gets down to the question if you're paying what are you paying now at Harvard for tuition plus board, you get these huge amounts of money. What are you getting? Are you getting indoctrination? Well, you don't need to pay that kind of money to get indoctrinated. Are you actually getting an education? Something that you can apply in a pragmatic way, an empirical manner, at classic what what university used to be. That's a serious part of the problem here.
Yeah. No, all excellent, well-placed points. I want to turn to audience questions. We're into the second half of the program. Recognizing none of us here are lawyers, but I want to ask the question about other tools, especially in the legal domain, on lawfare, whether this is especially, material support. I mean, Professor Steinberg, you touched on this as well, material support terrorist organizations. We talk of different organizations having been sued. There's a lawsuit now against AMP and SJP on behalf, but it's only one lawsuit, to my knowledge, announced May 1st on behalf of 9 victims, Israeli and American, of October 7th. So what kind of legal tools or other tools? I mean, I saw corporations announcing that they would be vetting applicants based on their participation here. So if you can both reflect on how to go after these endowment funds or other targets of legal action, and what kind of legal action and other types of action we can all consider.
As you pointed out, we're not lawyers, right?
Yeah.
Ira, you want to wade into this
Yeah,
one?
well, so I've been actually following some of these legal cases closely. The experience with them is that they take a very long time to play out, and the getting compliance from the universities is difficult. So just in a slightly different sphere, Harvard was sued by Asian American applicants for discrimination in admissions, and I was at that trial in the Boston federal courthouse, and they lost at the district court level. They lost at the appellate court level. They finally won at the Supreme Court level and basically got a ruling that they were discriminating. And what happened? Well, first of all, they changed the form, the admissions interview form, so it's going to be harder to actually measure the discrimination. They got rid of the academic and the extracurricular 1 to 3 ranking, and so they replaced it with like just a general contribution ranking. They went test optional for a while so that you couldn't measure the SAT score differences, and they certainly didn't lose any federal funding over it. And by the time these these cases work their way through, the students who are suing have graduated, or they've already graduated from other institutions. So it's not like a great, it just takes a long time. I mean, one move you could do is, especially with foreign students, if you kick them out, they lose their student visas and they ostensibly get deported. Now, obviously, there's a broader problem in the U.S. with immigration law enforcement, but it would be helpful to deport a lot of the leaders of these
Right.
campus protests are foreign students.
Right. No, it's a good point. It's actually just to continue the questions. I mean, certainly it's a talking point that we've heard in recent days that, anyone with Hamas links among the foreign should be deported immediately. So that may be something, in the offing in the coming months. But so kind of looking at that foreign source, so kind of how can we really, tackle that issue? I mean, is it a matter of expanding it to all foreign sources of funding, especially looking at Qatar's record here? It's the largest, I think, among the Arab states contributor to academic endowments in recent decade, I think. So, what are the mechanisms for tackling that, transparency on foreign funding, and maybe if you have an example or two on that.
Before we get to that,
sure.
On the legal remedies, except for beyond the foreign funding, Title VI has been used, I think, relatively successfully. You don't have to win necessarily a lawsuit, but you can put a university on a defense. And the Brandeis Law Center, Ken Marcus, has done that, I think, extremely well and systematically. They're the experts, and I think it's important that experts get involved. People who have a lot of experience take the lead on this and provide the information. Discovery. Once you have a lawsuit, if you get to the stage of discovery, one of the things that I've asked consistently for is discovery about funding. Who's funding you? And that is an element of this. So if we get to SJP, we get to Bazian, we get to AMP, that may be a part of it. So there are some tools, and I am very cautious about saying that these are going to solve the problems. I usually do not suggest, as a first remedy, legal action for all the reasons Ira talked about.
Yeah.
The other point I would make is that, we should be copying some of these tactics, not the foreign funding necessarily, but like a weekly Zoom call, exchanging tactics and talking points. Getting the Jewish pro-Israel students fired up and well organized. The sense I got at Harvard was just we were out organized. I mean, the Arab students had gotten into the admissions office and were helping make decisions about who got in, and so there needs to be a similar effort if we're going to improve these situations on other campuses where the in some cases like the Jews have taken the pro-Israel, even Christians, we need more pro-Israel Christians on all these campuses. And that's part of the problem too, is that particularly these northern campuses, America in general has a lot of pro-Israel evangelical Christians. And if you look around at most Ivy League campuses, they're not there. I think Harvard did a freshman survey, just 6% of the incoming freshman class at Harvard was even Protestant, let alone evangelical. Unrepresented.
Which you argue should be changed. Go ahead.
I want to go back to your question about foreign funding. I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, but I want to emphasize that because there I would start with Congress. A part of it is if some of the organizations that are openly funding these activities are not acting in consistency with the IRS regulations, the 501c3 regulations, that should be something that should be examined systematically. It's a huge industry. And I mentioned Tides Center, Tides Foundation, with 5 different branches, and all the money moves around in different shelves. It's real shell game. And the question is, has anybody looked at that? And that's all for progressive causes, just like people look at right-wing causes, the Koch brothers and others have their foundations. This one also should be looked at. I think also, by the way, it's been a mistake to to focus so much on Soros, because in this particular aspect, they're tertiary actors. They do support all the liberal causes, but on the campus stuff, they're tertiary. Whereas Tides and Westpac and Rockefeller Brothers are more out front. That's part of it, is enforcing or at least examining the degree to which various organizations are in compliance. But then you have, going back to the foreign funding, first of all, the issue, by the way, of students who are not citizens. Look, a lot of people arrested aren't even students.
Right.
I think, what was it, at Columbia, only a third of the students that were arrested, one of the New York campuses. I'm in Jerusalem, so it's a lot. To me, it all looks the same, right? A third of them only were students, something like that. Well, on a campus, it's supposed to be able to control its territory. There are restrictions. And when you have the kind of emergency situation where Jewish students are being attacked, Jewish faculty are being attacked, blatant calls for support for terrorism, that's where university administrators totally failed, by enforcing their own regulations. It's not about free speech. Even the basic trespassing issue should be examined. Make the campus safe for students, first of all, by not having people coming in who are going to abuse that privilege. And then it gets back to transparency. To me, every part of a university should put on record on a regular basis, whether it's quarterly or annually, what money they're getting from foreign governments. It's not illegal to accept money from foreign governments, but the public has a right to know. And if those foreign governments are involved in supporting terrorism, and there is a link between that funding and what goes on campus, that's something that should be addressed specifically. I think Congress is the appropriate address for that.
Right.
Because you'd have to change the regulations and demand and make sure that all organizations registered as 501c3s simply add a form which exists, but it's not mandatory. Make it mandatory, make it public. Who are your foreign government funders? So there are tools like that need to be addressed. Look, the United States is seen outside of the US as an easy target for all these things. You say free speech, all the language that's used, it's much looser than in Europe, and that's part of the American political culture. And I'm not saying that has to be changed, but there should be an awareness of how it is easily manipulated, and these are the results. So, and then that has to be addressed in some ways, because it does. Another principle is academic freedom. Well, if a Jew doesn't have the right to walk into the library, physically confronted, stopped from doing that. If a speaker, I have to say, when I spoke at Columbia a few years ago, there was the front row of the audience were people with signs and T-shirts, which were the slogans of Rivers to the Sea, but nobody disrupted me. And they walked out. There was no dialogue. There was no challenge in terms of what I was talking about, which was probably then about the Egyptian. I wrote a book about Sadat and Begin based on Israeli documentation, and behind the Jimmy Carter myths of the peace treaty, that was the topic. And they didn't find that to be exciting enough to stay and hang on and listen to learn something. So when you that's the attitude on campus, that's also got to be addressed.
Right, right. No, I think that's all a great point, and a segue to actually just a clarification footnote on your earlier point about Title VI. So for our audience members, that's of the Civil Rights Act.
Civil Rights
So
Act.
since 2019, anti-Semitism is now one of the forms of discrimination that actually universities are required to respond to complaints. And so that, there is the area of oversight, that how quickly, how responsive is the university towards addressing those complaints. And so there are a number, CUNY and others, the dragging their feet before October 7th. Now, of course, much more so the case. Still quite a few, we've talked quite a bit on funding and organizations. In the last 10 minutes or so, a number of questions on organization, how closely, is this simply a correlation between, I think the answer is not, between a number of these veteran protesters, agitators, and who we're seeing on campuses? Or what have you both seen in terms of direct coordination, support, both in the planning of these protests as well as and who's involved in that? Briefly, if you could touch on that.
But we know that, I think October 8th already, right after the Hamas slaughter, Students for Justice for Palestine and National Students for Justice for Palestine, these are, in theory, separate organizations, put out this toolkit which had a series of very specific actions. They were coordinated.
Right.
And I think NGO Monitor's identified something like 85 Twitter X accounts. What's the language we use these days? Of SJP campus branches. And the messaging is all the same. And there are also Instagram accounts. I don't have the numbers in front of me. There's Telegram accounts. There are various different versions of that. So there is clearly coordination there. I was right that you can identify, it hasn't been done yet systematically, you can identify individuals whose names keep popping up. They were the same names who led the BDS divestment resolutions. They went from campus to campus. Students who were on 6 different campuses over a span of 8 years. All right, so obviously that's a fiction. And the question is, that gets back to the question of trying to transparency for funding. So there is an organization, there is close coordination. It's hidden, and it needs, as we said earlier, there needs to be a serious effort to make that visible through whatever documentation is available. For people who are interested in this, there are a number of websites, because the non-governmental NGO organizations, the ones that have 501c3 or C4 status, submit their 990 forms to the IRS. Those are available. Sometimes they're dozens of pages long, and you can go through them. And it's interesting to look at the individuals. Sometimes you'll see an organization that raises money for Palestinian children. All the people on the board have the same last name, and they pay themselves surprisingly large salaries, and they're there for many, many years. You can learn interesting things. What you don't learn is where their money's coming from. When you're talking about, I think one of them has something like $15 million a year, just as an example. So there are tools that are out there. They're accessible online, and that does provide some information. Mostly it tells you what they're not telling anybody, and that's also significant.
It's interesting, just if I may, I mean, one question that's come up from our audience, so a lot of these organizations, Professor Steinberg, you described them as Jewish fig leaf organizations, but the branding as a Jewish group clearly meant to drive a wedge within the American Jewish community. But I mean, first of all, what do you make of that kind of pathology or pattern of branding among many of these groups as Jewish organizations? And then again, thinking about responses and maybe even legal recourse, I mean, is there any sort of way to address that? I mean, is misrepresentation of some kind? I mean, if you can weigh in on that aspect of it.
I mean,
Go ahead,
one
Ira.
of the, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, go ahead.
I went up to one of the Harvard protests early on, and it was surprising to me. The protest began with this sort of mousy keffiyeh wearing woman with glasses, and she said,
reading on her iPhone, probably.
Exactly. I am your Jewish friend, and I want you to know that anytime you think that anything you may be doing for the rest of the rally is anti-Semitic, don't, throw away that thought. I am here with you. And I have no idea if the person actually was Jewish or not. Some of these people have one Jewish parent. They may not have any serious Jewish education. The only way they engage Jewishly may be serving as like a token Jew for a pro-Hamas protest. But the people in charge of these protests have clearly figured out that they can neutralize the anti-Semitism. I mean, even like Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project was on Twitter earlier today saying, oh, how can these protests be anti-Semitic? And she was fighting with Hillary Clinton, who actually has been good on this stuff. Like, how can they be anti-Semitic? They have Jews involved. And it was a great Bernard Lewis insight, who said that in the medieval times, you could convert out of Judaism and become a Christian and avoid the anti-Semitism. And now you can do a similar thing by renouncing Zionism and winning acceptance. and this is like a version of something we've seen through Jewish history
Mhm.
for years, of basically just traitors, informers to the authorities. So you know, and the way to answer it is you look at the polls, and 90% of American Jews support Israel. So I mean, these people were trying to. It's just totally unrepresentative. And when you scratch on who these people are, you know, it's not like it's hardcore necessarily, like, you know, real, like, I mean, not to like define people as not really Jewish, but you know, it's just like
Look,
it's not
there's a,
not the
there actually
Orthodox
have been
rabbis leading these protests.
there've been some
Yeah.
detailed examinations. Commentary ran a good piece. I don't remember who wrote it, that called Jewish Voice for Peace, not Jewish, not for peace. And a lot of the people, the names, a lot of the people who will run branches of Jewish Voice for Peace are not, in fact, identified as Jewish. They do not identify themselves as Jewish, even with one Jewish parent and minimal Jewish education. Some do. So the different variations, many of them have deep anger. You know, there are psychological aspects, and we know the history. The late Ed Alexander wrote a great book called Jews Against Themselves. And David Hirsch in London has a chapter in his book on anti-Semitism about Jewish anti-Zionists. But it's the fact that you have somebody like Stephen Hines, who has this brilliant idea of bringing peace to the Middle East by finding these few individuals, that 5%, adding to them people who are not Jewish, and then promoting these organizations by giving them a lot of money. They can do PR. And I think we need to burst some of those bubbles, specifically pointing out these are organizations. Some are Jewish, some are not, but they have zero standing. They're fringe Jewish organizations. They are very much like the individuals back in the Middle Ages who would engage in these debates, Barcelona debate and elsewhere, where they would have a famous, well-known rabbi, Ramban and others, would go, and the king would be there judging them. They would have to defend themselves before a Christian audience. And the person who would then lead the attacks against the Jews would be memumarim, people who converted out for personal reasons and became really the voice for anti-Semitism in that community. Pablo Christianity is the one I think that was Barcelona, is one of the best known of that. And you can tell by his name, I've forgotten what his name was before he converted out, but he adopted the name Pablo Christiani. Okay, and that really is an analogy we can look at. It exists in every generation, and you can't get rid of these people, but what you can do is really criticize and condemn those who are giving them artificially from the outside the ability to claim to have some sort of status and provide that, hey, I'm your Jewish fig leaf, and what you're saying is not anti-Semitism, which Ira, you saw, and we've seen in other places too. The campus as a Jew character.
Yeah. Well, one of our audience members has a great creative idea of maybe creating an organization, a Jewish organization, calling itself Palestine for Zionism, kind of as a counterforce. But so maybe a project for next time. But I think 1 minute left. I just want to thank our distinguished panelists, all the great ideas, as well as our audience. I failed at getting to all the questions, but there are so many great ones, and I hope a lot of it was covered in our discussion. I mean, if anything, it goes back to a point that Mr. Slow raised at some point in the middle about how we just need to be doing a better job at organizing, at being, talking the right way in a unified voice about these things, having the right tools and the right, framework for addressing them. But obviously, this is probably not our last go at this, unfortunately, this issue. So I look forward to learning from you both at future occasions. And again, thank you both again, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today for your time. And yeah.
Thank you.
And again, a Chag Sameach to Israel. Yeah.
Do our best.
Yeah.